Good morning, colleagues, and good morning to our witnesses this morning. This is a public session. It is live broadcast, so if all colleagues would be aware, and if I could just turn to the witnesses, we have had all of your biographies sent to us beforehand, and we have given you notice of the questions that will be asked. There may be supplementaries from those questions for our witnesses. If witnesses would like to make a very brief opening statement to just set the tone for the committee, that would be most useful. And all the transcripts will be sent to you once the session is over. And if there are any changes that need to be made, corrections that need to be made, if our witnesses would send those back as quickly as possible. So if I may introduce to the committee the four witnesses we have this morning, we would like to welcome Helen Foord, who's Head of Government Relations and Public Policy at Groupe PSA UK in Vauxhall, Jill Adamson, who's the Head of Financial Reporting and Tax at Alexander Dennis, Neil Fryer from Delphi Technologies, and Paul Everitt, who's Chief Executive Officer at ADS. Good morning and welcome to you all. If you would like to start, and if I may just start by asking Helen to start the proceedings with a very, very brief introduction.
Baroness, thank you everybody for the invite to give evidence today. I represent in the UK the brands Vauxhall, Peugeot, Citroën and DS. We have two manufacturing sites in Luton and Ellesmere Port, and thank you for asking me to give evidence today.
Thank you. So could I ask Jill to join?
Good morning, thank you, Baroness. I represent Alexander Dennis Limited. We're the world's leading manufacturer of double-deck buses. We have 3 manufacturing sites in the UK at Guildford, Scarborough and Falkirk, and we're grateful for the opportunity to present to the committee today.
Thank you. Mr. Fryer?
Hello, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to participate today. I work for Delphi Technologies, which is a supplier to vehicle manufacturers, producing propulsion systems for petrol, diesel, hybrid and electric vehicles. We have 6 sites in the UK covering manufacturing, engineering and aftermarket.
Thank you very much. And Paul, Mr. Paul Everitt.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Paul Everitt. I'm the Chief Executive of ADS, which is the UK's National Trade Association for Aerospace, Defence, Space and Security. Clearly for us, trade with our European Union partners is a very, very high priority.
Thank you very much. And if I may start by putting to you the first question, and that is, how will before I start, just to give title to this inquiry, it is about beyond tariffs facilitating UK-EU trade in manufactured goods. If I may start by saying, how will non-tariff barriers affect your businesses or the businesses you represent at the end of this transition period? And how much of an obstacle do you think it could be for the future of EU-UK trade? Let's start in the order we started in our introductions. I think that will be helpful.
Thank you. I'll begin. So the automotive industry is a heavily regulated industry, and we currently start from a position where we start from the same place from a technical perspective as the European Union. So for the minute we type approve, all the regulations affecting the vehicles that we sell are the same in the UK as they are in the EU. We type approved goods vehicles to sell on the market. Without that type approval, you cannot sell a vehicle on the market. So as we move to leave the EU, what's critical for our industry is that we keep that regulatory alignment from a technical perspective. As soon as we move away from, as soon as we diverge from those regulations, we enter into a scenario that's unprecedented for our sector from a European point of view. And all that does is add cost to our vehicles. Cost in type approvals, because potentially we would have to replicate all our crash testing that we do in Europe for the UK, for exactly the same vehicles. That adds tens of millions of costs just from a type approval perspective. But then if we look further down the line, there's the greater possibility for regulatory divergence from anything from autonomous vehicles to crash testing. Having slightly different rules means that vehicles will have to be adapted to additional costs to sell on the markets.
Thank you. If I may ask Jill to join in.
Yes, Alexander Dennis's main concern is around the administration of the imports and exports will replace the acquisitions and dispatches with the EU. We do not currently sell many products into the UK, but around 20 to 30% of our supply base is from the EU. A single double-deck bus contains around 10,000 components, and to organise the administration of the paperwork around all those components will be a significant burden to us. We're a relatively small company compared to the likes of Peugeot, and we have a small trade compliance team at the moment that we would need to maybe triple or even quadruple to meet these requirements.
Thank you. Neil?
Yes, thank you. Maybe I can just focus on the part of the business I'm responsible for, which is the aftermarket. As vehicles, we are heavily regulated, and many components that we sell require safety regulation, particularly, for example, brake parts. So if there were a divergence of regulation between the UK and the EU, that would mean that we would test thousands of parts twice and get certification twice, which would be complex and costly for our business. So yes, we would like to see a convergence or a continuance of the same regulations with the EU to avoid that cost.
And Paul, if you'd like to add before I come back with a supplementary.
Yeah, surely. I mean, for us, sort of two key issues. One is definitely a regulatory alignment. The UK is part of the European Aviation Safety Agency, which has governed all aspects of aircraft and aviation, both design and use over probably the last 15, 16 years. Clearly, when we leave, when we complete the transition period, it's essential that relationship is sustained, and that we don't create a situation where, again, as I've mentioned, we are having to undertake twice the certification processes for our both parts and whole products, but also more importantly, that we need to be part of the shaping of the future rules and regulations for our industry. It's very much an international, aviation is an international business. The key drivers for regulatory development are in Europe, they're in the US, and perhaps coming up more quickly in China. And to shape those regulatory regimes is one of the ways in which we can access not just a European market, but a much broader global market. And the second key concern for us is really friction at the border. So the customs arrangements, as well as the management of the border, will be crucial for us in terms of minimising future costs.
Thank you. Helen, if I may just ask you, could you please put your microphone a little bit closer to your mouth? It's just the sound will get better, I think. It's quite difficult.
Is that better?
Could you do it a little bit higher, if that's all right?
Better?
Yeah, you may just have to speak a little louder. I think it's quite a faded response back. If I may, and it's really basically, there's been a lot of discussions in the past few months about trying to make sure that businesses such as yourself from the government have been saying that there's been a lot of work going on to address a number of the issues that you've raised. If you had an opportunity to put one question directly back to the government, what would that be? Because, administration costs are coming up quite frequently as a discussion point, but so are alignment of regs. So maybe if you had that opportunity to put a question back to the government directly, what would that be today? Paul?
I guess the one question that we would very much want to put to government is to understand their rationale for not seeking to continue to be part of the European Aviation Safety Agency. We've been told by government that they are not, but there is no safety case established as to why we shouldn't continue. We believe there are
Thank you. Neil?
Yes, similarly, I think for us the question is, will we continue to have the same regulations as Europe? And kind of the supplementary question to that will be, when will we know? Because we need to make preparations if that's not the case.
Thank you. Jill?
I have nothing further to add than when will we know to be prepared.
Thank you. And finally, Helen?
Absolutely. When will we know is critical. We have to plan. We have less than 6 months. So either way, we need to know.
Thank you. So if I may turn to Lord Turnbull. Lord Turnbull. Lord Turnbull, could you unmute your microphone?
Is that better?
That's perfect. Thank you.
We've been talking about regulations as part of the suite of non-tariff barriers. I want to come on to what some people think is the most difficult issue, which are rules of origin, and I think the questions coming after will follow that up as well, is how important are the negotiations on this for your businesses? And you could look at it as a way, as supposing rules of origin were being applied now, and you did the calculation of what is UK content, how far adrift do you think you would be of where these regulations might end up? And what is the amount of adjustment that you might have to make?
Thank you. Are you directing that at any particular witness?
No, well, I think it applies to aerospace and vehicles equally.
Right. So if we start then by asking Jill.
Our supply base in the UK is fairly limited for the components that we have. Many of our vehicles are bespoke, and the components that are required are actually requested by the operators, the bus operators, our customers. That results in the fact that maybe around 30 to 40% of the components of a UK bus are from the EU, with others coming from other places around the world. If we were looking at a percentage of, say, a regional value content similar to other free trade agreements, I think we would struggle to get to the 40, 50, 60% that is in some free trade agreements.
Thank you, Neil.
As far as our content is concerned, I think we're really focused on UK content. We would have to accumulate that with the EU to really understand, and I don't have that detail with me today. But what I would say is that in many cases, the products that we manufacture or finish in our UK plants have components that come from around the EU. So from our point of view, when we're selling, the important thing is that we need to be able to say, are we selling for a UK produced component in the future, or are we selling an EU produced component? So as I say, I think we would need to come back to you with some detail on that.
That would be very helpful. Thank you. And Paul?
So I guess, and I would say aerospace is slightly different because there is a long-standing plurilateral agreement on sale of aircraft and aircraft parts, which is predominantly around removing tariffs, but it also addresses rules of origin. So for the overwhelming majority of transactions, rules of origin have not been, and we don't believe they will be a limiting factor. There are some finished parts and some raw materials that may be slightly nuanced around that, but it's not been our biggest focus of concern.
Thank you. And finally to Helen.
From a business and from the UK automotive business as a whole, rules of origin and making sure we can meet the rules of origins that are determined are critical to ensuring that our products benefit from 0% tariff. The industry is used to global supply chains, and we have a very complex supply chain system. The majority of our suppliers are based currently in the UK and the EU, but there's also, as we move to battery electric vehicles, a lot of those major components now are currently sourced in Asia. So if I take one step backwards, if we look at the content of our vehicles, what we count first is the UK and EU content, because our assumption is that we will have that bilateral accumulation. From an industry point of view, we would look at levels around about 50 or 55% of originating content between those two countries. That's an industry point of view, and if it's set at that level, then we believe the majority of our vehicles will be benefit from 0% tariff. But when we take that argument, we put that to a battery electric vehicle, where the battery, which is a high value part, tends to come from the Asian markets as the European and the UK market start to develop their battery technology. Those vehicles then will fall foul of actually meeting rules of origin levels. So they could incur a 10% tariff unless we have a bespoke arrangement for the battery itself. That's very important.
Thank you. I can see Lord Lamont wants to just come in on that. Lord Lamont, would you unmute?
Yeah, just very, very briefly. Very interesting what you were saying about...
Lord Lamont, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Very interesting what you were saying about battery and electric cars in Asia. Will any of the plans for supplies from Asia, supply chains in Asia, have been altered by the pandemic? I mean, I have read that in some newspapers.
To date, to my knowledge, we're still a producer. Now that our manufacturing facilities have restarted in Europe, we are still producing our battery electric vehicles currently. So far, from a Groupe PSA perspective, we haven't seen any impacts on those supplies coming in to date.
Thank you. Baroness Chalker. Baroness Chalker, could you unmute?
I have just done so.
Thank you.
Could I follow up and I think start with Helen in view of what she's just said? I wonder how the rules of origin will affect the business decisions about where, in which country to locate their activities or source their components. It seems to me that this has big implications for the integrated supply chains, which we're used to, including the supply chains with the other third countries, such as Asia, which she has just remarked upon. Helen?
Yes, so as we go forward, when we source a part, then we have to undergo a variety of different analysis on where the part's being sourced off, what are the free trade agreements, and then whether with that particular component that alters the rules of origin for our key market. So going forward, absolutely, that's going to have to be a focus for our organisation to say if you are sourcing, and if I take an example of an engine, which is a high value part, which has the ability to tip, obviously, the rules of origin from one way or another, depending on where that actual engine comes from. So if we currently source those engines in Europe, if we change that sourcing from elsewhere, then our vehicles all of a sudden we will find won't meet rules of origin. So for certain models, that's going to be a key element going forward, as the lines and the levels of rules of origin and how they're determined. If your vehicle is on the cusp of that, then any small purchasing decision could move your vehicle either way to be not meet rules of origin and then have a 10%. So it's a very complex picture, and it changes constantly in automotive. We're constantly looking at sourcing alternative parts as we move to look at carbon as well, moving actually from a carbon point of view, moving major components closer. And we've announced heavy investments in battery manufacturing facilities across Europe recently.
Thank you, Baroness Chalker.
I'm just trying to unmute. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
I just wonder whether any of the others have other views, because I would have thought that was the same across all the industries.
Yeah, Neil.
Yes, just add something from the point of view of a supplier. I mean, we would be supplying components to Helen, for example, PSA. We have around 24 manufacturing sites globally, and we could be in a position where rules of origin restrictions or requirements would cause us to move production of a particular component from one plant to another in a different location, in order to help us satisfy our customers' requirements in terms of rules of origin. For example, if we're making a component for an engine, and that's something that may tip the balance for our customer in terms of their where they can say the vehicle was produced, we could move from a plant to another plant in a different location, from the UK to the EU, but equally from Asia to the EU, if it made sense to do so and it helped us to satisfy our customers. So I think those things will drive some decisions, maybe not in the situation of plants themselves, but in what's produced where as we go forward.
Thank you. Just before somebody else answers, could I just ask Lord Turnbull, you wanted to come in?
Yes. Could this in a perverse way actually benefit the UK? Because one of the choices you would have is to take production somewhere else in the world, let's say Malaysia. You could bring that into the EU and improve your rules of origin score, or you could bring it into the UK and improve your rules of origin score. It may add no costs, but it would actually benefit or divert production into the UK.
I think you would have to look at individual cases, but for us at least, the UK is relatively a small customer base. So we've got 87 global customers around the world for our products in terms of original equipment supply. Only 2 of those are based in the UK. So I think in the management of a global business, these decisions are much more finely balanced. If it were the case that the UK had such an advantageous trading relationship with many other geographies, maybe we would make that decision. But at the moment, it remains to be seen exactly what those trading arrangements are going to be.
Jill?
Yes, I think partly in response to Lord Turnbull's question, I think there's 2 issues there. There's the timing issue. There's the timing issue of the investment required in the UK to bring the supply base up, and that will take time, I believe. And the other timing issue is on existing free trade agreements. So if for us in the bus industry, the import duty into the EU on a completed bus is 16%. The average import duty on components into the UK under the new global tariff is between 2 and 4%. So the completed bus value, and our buses are maybe a double decks, maybe say £250,000. So it's a large percentage on a big number of value. If you think that by perhaps manufacturing the EU, you can benefit from other free trade agreements with, say, Canada, Mexico, wherever, that would influence where we wish to manufacture in the future. And that's why I see timing, because these free trade agreements with the EU took many years to negotiate, and to replicate that out of the UK, the supply base and percentage aside, that all takes a lot of time. And therefore a lot of cost between now and when those free trade agreements are concluded.
Thank you. Paul, did you have anything to add?
Not particularly. I mean, obviously, I think the new arrangements with the European Union and the impact on customs arrangements and costs of customs arrangements will inevitably impact on how people understand and replan their supply chains. There will doubtless be situations where we win, but I think the biggest concern at the moment is that there are probably more places where we'll lose.
Thank you. Lord Russell?
Yes, I mean, what is very clear from all of the evidence we've heard to date is that the rules of origin area is incredibly complex. But I would imagine each of you in your businesses have made some rough estimate of the costs that would be associated with proving rules of origin. If you compare that with what it would cost your business to just trade under the EU's existing external tariffs on materials and products that your businesses use, how do the relative costs compare? Proving rules of origin versus living with the EU's existing tariffs. And if I could start off with Helen.
Yeah, of course. So when we look at rules of origin, yes, there is an administrative burden improving the rules of origin, but that administrative burden, you're talking thousands of pounds, whereas the risk of our products, and in that I'm talking about cars as well as parts, they're whole vehicles, the risk of the tariffs associated with those products runs into hundreds of millions of pounds. So it is by far the most important point for our organisation is to get the rules of origin correct. As you can see, the vast difference. We'll happily pay a few £100,000 for the admin to save hundreds of millions of pounds on tariffs, which is additional cost to our business across Europe, not just the UK.
Would that be the same for you, Jill?
Yes, it would, very much so. I would add, though, that I think that one of the issues in the rules of origin and proving origin is that sometimes suppliers are not able to prove the origin themselves, so they're unwilling to provide a certificate of origin. So whilst we would like to do all the admin, and as Helen said, it's very well worthwhile in a cost-benefit analysis, sometimes it's actually impossible.
And Paul, how does that apply to aviation and defence?
So as I said earlier, I mean, so for aerospace, there is a pre-existing plurilateral agreement, which means that rules of origin are not such a major concern for us. And around defence, there are other regimes, so the export controls and export licensing, which are more significant in determining access to the markets and the opportunities that are there for our industry. So for us, rules of origin, I said at the beginning, has not been our biggest focus.
And I have one supplementary, and if I could start off for Helen. One of the suggestions to get around some of the complexities of rules of origin is for the UK government to join the Pan-Euro-Mediterranean Region Convention on Rules of Origin. Have you looked at that as an option, and do you think it's realistic?
Yeah. The acts, what PEM does, it gives the opportunity for additional accumulation. So it doesn't replace the need for rules of origin between the UK and the EU. But as we've already described before, we're very much a European supply chain. We have a manufacturing facility in Morocco, which is within the PEM region, and we have supplies from Turkey. So having the same rules as what's applied to PEM and apply that to the UK EU certainly helps with an administrative burden, definitely.
And could I ask Neil the same question?
Yes, again, I think that that would help us. We have manufacturing and suppliers in Turkey, so that would certainly help us if there was alignment.
And Jill, I saw you nodding when Helen was talking.
Yes, I agree with both Helen and Neil completely.
Thank you. If I may turn to Lord Inglewood.
Thanks, Chairman. My question is really, I think, addressed to each of our witnesses, please. So if you were able to answer in turn, I think that would be the most satisfactory. And it's based on the premise that there will be some kind of UK-EU trade agreement. And given that, what specific regulatory provisions do you think are most important to each of you and your businesses? And secondly, in the event of having some form of regulatory cooperation, how would you like to see that operate in areas such as testing, certification, compliance, and even creation? Please. So I don't know who'd like to start.
I don't like to go off, if that would be helpful.
Yeah.
So for UK aerospace industry, we want to be as closely aligned with Europe around aviation safety. We've been part of the European aviation safety regime over a long period of time, and that's worked extremely well. In the current negotiations, the UK is negotiating what's known as a bilateral aviation safety agreement. And certainly our ambition for that agreement is that there is as much equivalence and kind of recognition of that particular arrangement, so that something that was certified in the UK would be recognised as appropriate in the EU, and that would also be the basis on which we would wish to pursue other bilateral agreements with other key markets. I think our challenge at the moment is that a bilateral aviation safety agreement is something that is normally negotiated separate to a free trade agreement. It's quite a specialist area, and where generally speaking, it's not regarded as competitive. This is about ensuring that the aviation sector works efficiently, effectively, and most importantly, safely. You know, where we are currently, because there's been little progress in the current negotiations, we fear that we will not get the time necessary to agree that set of arrangements, and therefore that poses a very significant risk short term, but also longer term. If we don't have a level of mutual recognition, that will add costs to UK operators, and particularly when we start to look at new developments, particularly for aviation, like other areas, we're looking at decarbonisation and the road to net zero. So we will be looking at faster rates of development. If we have to develop and then test and certify in the UK and in other key markets, that would limit our opportunity globally.
Fine, thank you. And then what do other witnesses feel?
So shall we go to Neil and then to
Yes.
Helen and to Jill?
Yes, I think the important thing for us is really harmonisation in regulation. If I take the example of emissions legislation, many of our components that we produce in the UK are built into systems that are then supplied to vehicle manufacturers who need to meet emissions regulations. And if there's significant divergence, it means additional testing for our products to make sure they meet the standards. And it means that it would make our life much more complex. Similarly, as I mentioned before, in the aftermarket, safety critical products like brakes have a regulation. And if there's divergence between the UK and the EU, that will add cost and complexity to our business too. So I think really at a minimum, what we're looking for is mutual recognition of standards, if not the same standards.
Thank you, Helen.
I would agree. Certainly, we've started from the point of view that we have obviously full alignment. So how we can keep that going forward is exceptionally beneficial to prevent that duplication of crash testing, to prevent any additional cost then to customers in the UK. Now, while a lot of vehicle legislation is set at a UN a United Nations EC level, it is making sure that the rest of those regulations that currently come from the EU, that we have that full alignment, is critical going forward for us. The UK have put forward a technical annex for automotive to the free trade agreement, and that's one way in which you can govern how that relationship continues over time. And we hope that that regulatory annex will enable us to have that from a more automotive perspective, have that alignment with the EU going forward.
Thank you. Jill.
The conformity of regulation is not quite as important for us. The double deck's a very bespoke vehicle, and we have to meet requirements for different customers and different specs all the time. So we're not so worried about that. What we are very concerned about is to ensure mutual recognition of conformity assessments. Without that, we would have huge additional costs.
Thank you. Now, Lord Inglewood, do you have anything?
Could I just follow up by saying that the case for Brexit was that if we left the European single market, there would be other markets we could go into and align ourselves to, and that would be good for business in Britain. Does proximity to the adjacent market matter to your businesses as they are established in this country?
If I may, yes, we build and sell for European markets. The US market and the Asian market is different, and you build and sell for those markets. If, for example, we were going to have a free trade agreement with the US, if we just take the testing of airbags in an EU, and in that I mean a UK point of view, we test an airbag assuming that the driver is wearing a seatbelt. In America, they test the airbag assuming that the driver doesn't wear a seatbelt. So both the tests are different, and therefore there's regulatory divergence, which means that any products would have to sell on the US market would fundamentally have to change in order to comply with their requirements, and that is an additional cost.
Thank you. Lord Lamont, you wanted to come in?
Yes, I wanted to ask specifically to Helen. I mean, all the witnesses have
repeatedly made the case about the need for alignment. I think we all get that. We all understand that, although there may be a basis on which the government can say we will align, but we wish to have a degree of freedom to alter over time. But what I'd like to ask Helen is, when you put these points about alignment to the government, what do the government say to you?
I think when we speak to the team the team, for us, the important communication we have is through the Department for Business and their negotiating team. When we explain to them the issues that we have from a technical point of view, we're very specifically here talking about technical regulations impacting the actual vehicle itself. They fully understand the implications of diversions and the cost on our business. That's perhaps why the UK put forward a technical annex, but specifically for automotive, to help address our concerns. So I would say that they have taken those concerns into consideration.
Thank you. Do any of our other witnesses wish to comment?
Only to say I guess, so in the UK, we don't have a UK market for aerospace products. There's effectively a duopoly with Airbus and Boeing, certainly for large aircraft. So we are a supplier of high value parts to those businesses: wings, engines, landing gear, avionics, a whole range of things. And so there is only one international market for aerospace. So having a UK tailored approach doesn't really add any value and doesn't offer any new opportunities. As I say, when we presented to government at various different times those arguments, government, and certainly on the technical level, we are in agreement. However, for political reasons, we are going down a route of divergence, which certainly our industry feels is not in the UK's best interest.
Thank you. Lord Lilly, you wanted to come in. You have to unmute, Lord Lilly. Lord Lilly, unmute.
I'm unmuted. Could I ask Helen, rather? I understand that ahead of a potential departure without a withdrawal agreement in March and October last year, one or more British manufacturers had their type assessments recertified in Sweden. Was this general? Was it done by all companies for all models that sell in the European market? And if so, how long will that be valid?
As we have left the European Union and at the end of transition, we will have to have a UK type approval to sell any goods on the UK market or any cars on the UK market. And equally, we have to have an EU type approval to sell any EU cars on the EU market. So going forward, we will have to have separate UK type approvals and EU type approvals. What we're seeking is the evidence that we present for those type approvals. We had to use permissible evidence from testing that we may do in Europe to use for our UK type approvals, because it's that physical testing, that crash testing of a vehicle that is exceptionally costly, and that's what adds the millions of pounds to our business if we have to replicate those exact tests twice in the UK. So what you may have seen, and I can't speak for any other manufacturers, but from our point of view, our EU testing has always been undertaken in continental Europe. So there was we hadn't changed anything going forward, but when we leave the UK, we will have a UK type approval number that will be given to us by the Department for Transport, and then over time they will develop their own UK type approval system as we go forward, because that will just be temporary first of all.
But if we unilaterally accept the type approval testing on the continent, then that doesn't aggravate things for you.
We will still have, like I said, we will still have to have a UK type approval, but using
yeah, but if we just give it,
yes, if we're using that evidence, will be a lot easier for us. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Lord Wood.
Yeah, I actually, a question I wanted to ask has partly been answered, which Jill raised a question of mutual recognition, specifically of conformity assessments, which I was interested in. But I guess more broadly, I'd like to ask Helen, but also from a sector point of view on aviation and buses, Jill and Paul as well. Are there specific examples of mutual recognition agreements elsewhere, maybe EU trade deals with other countries or non-EU trade deals, that with third countries that you think have worked particularly well and might serve as an example in the kind of deal that you're looking for?
I think when we, sorry, would you like me to start?
Yeah, Helen, why don't you go first? Yeah, thanks.
Apologies. I think when we're looking at the technical barriers to trade that we're talking about specifically now, if we look to the EU-Japan agreement, where that is that technical annex relating to automotive, the understanding is that that agreement, obviously it's relatively new, but that addresses a lot of the concerns. So that there are some examples out there, and the same with EU-Canada. There are some areas within that that addresses some of those concerns. So that it is possible.
Just sorry to push you just a little bit. Can you just give a couple of examples of what's in those annexes that is so helpful to you, specifically?
Those specific annexes, I apologise that I don't have the technical or trade knowledge to understand them fully, but we can certainly get back to you afterwards.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Jill, do you want to join in?
I don't have anything to add to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Neil?
No, nothing to add from my side.
Paul?
Well, only say again, bilateral aviation safety agreements are part and parcel of the way the industry operates. And so the EU and the European Aviation Safety Agency has a variety of bilateral agreements with other major markets. And clearly the UK has benefited from those. In doing the no deal planning last year, the year before, we worked closely with the Department for Transport to effectively put into place those sorts of bilateral agreements with some of our major markets, the US, Canada, Brazil, amongst many others. So there is a framework there. Our challenge is that it's a negotiation, and our European partners don't necessarily have to agree to all of the things that we would like to see.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
Thank you. Thanks.
Lord Faulkner.
Good morning. I'd like to ask about UK-EU customs checks, which may come in at the end of the transition period. I know that in the SMMT has gone on the record about the possibility that every minute of delay could cost approximately £50,000 in gross value added to the industry, totaling over £70 million per day. Staggering figure. Can I ask whether, first of all, whether you agree that that is a realistic assessment for the automotive industry, and also whether there is an equivalent figure for the aviation, because I think there's an ADS estimate of around £1.5 billion per year. If these figures are correct, what should we be doing to try to prevent it?
Do you want to start with Paul, Lord Faulkner?
Yes, we'll start with Paul, please.
So unquestionably, so we did some early work when we were looking again at the kind of what were the priorities for our for the relationship or the future relationship, and friction at the border was clearly one of the issues for our sector. We are not quite as just in time as the automotive sector, but for aerospace, we are an international supply chain. Many of the parts that we produce are quite complex. They involve quite a lot of what we term surface treatment. So there are a certain number of journeys and a limited number of places where some of those activities can be taken place. So there are a number of borders that get crisscrossed on a regular basis. So for us, ensuring that we minimise the sort of friction at the border, which comes down to what our customs processes are. And also, it's also linked to our earlier discussion about regulatory alignment, because one of the reasons why goods may need to be checked is to check that they're actually compliant and able to be put onto that market. So sort of ensuring that we limit the reasons why there need to be significant checks at the border, and ensuring that as much of the process can be done away from the border are clearly high priorities.
Is that the view of Helen and Jill? Do they take the same view as far as the automotive?
Yeah, absolutely. From an automotive perspective, and I agree with Paul. Having those less having some operational simplification at the border to enable goods to move freely, and then to undertake some of those checks away from the border or on a later date is essential. So you refer to the Motor Manufacturing Traders Association's figure. From a company point of view, just in time, some of our parts can have a 30-minute delivery window, and we operate just in time, and it means just in time. So if there's any delay to that process, we measure it internally. A production line stoppage is measured in minutes, and it's a significant amount of money each minute that production is stopped for an unplanned stopped. So yes, it's critical to our business to ensure that we can maintain those flows of goods to feed our just-in-time process.
And you keep making that point to the government, I expect, do you?
Absolutely.
Lord Lilly wanted to come in. Unmute, Lord Lilly.
On average, over the last 20 years, Operation Stack has been in force for 11 days a year. In 2015, it was in operation for 23 days more or less continuously, which means that there are hold-ups across the channel. I know because I travel back and forth. They're very painful, and I'm sure they cause some disruption to car factories and so on. But at the time, and looking in the press, there's never been any reports of factories closing down, never complaints in the press that when the fishermen blockade Calais, it's costing you £70 million a day. So what happens in practice when there are delays across the channel?
Jill?
I just wanted to reference back to March 2019 when we thought there might be a hard Brexit, and we stockpiled for that period. Now we stockpiled between 3 and 4 weeks worth of components. That was 20 million we stockpiled, and that was stockpiled for a period of 3 months. That cost us about £200,000 in terms of additional working capital. Sorry.
And in the past, when there have been these delays across the channel, has that had the same effect?
No, they haven't been as significant, no.
Helen?
If I may, yeah, Lord Lilly, what we have done in those situations is, Calais isn't a major route for us. We do have some goods going for there, but we also have ability to divert and use other ports. And that's very much what we did at that time, because we did have an issue. We actually had an issue at our facility in our Luton plant. So we diverted parts through other ports, and that's the route that we took. And if I may, for a hard Brexit, stockpiling from an automotive point of view, we have thousands of parts coming in every day. We could probably only have space to stockpile for a number of days. So actually, it's exceptionally costly for our business. And actually just physically having the space to stockpile those parts is practically impossible.
Neil, you wanted to come in.
Yes, if I may, from the point of view of a supplier, I hear exactly what Helen and Jill are saying, but from the point of view of the supplier, if we fail to supply and thereby stop the production line in a plant, we are subject to fines from the vehicle manufacturer as a result of stopping production. So we have to find ways to get the products to the plants on time to meet that 30-minute delivery window. And in many cases where there may have been something like Operation Stack, we may well even have resorted to flying the parts in to avoid stopping production lines, which is a significant cost for our business, but probably less than the fines that we would receive from our customers if we stop their production. So I think when you think about this in the longer term, we may well have to start thinking about setting up inventory very close to our customers' plants in Europe, the parts that we send from the UK, in order to buffer against friction in border crossings. And that's a cost, of course. And coming back to the discussion we were having before, that's something that in the long run might make us decide, actually, it's easier for us to produce these parts in Romania and supply them to Sweden than it is to produce them in the UK and supply them to Sweden, because we can eliminate that risk. We don't need to pay for that inventory.
Thank you. Lord Falconer, very briefly.
Very briefly, I just wanted to ask for confirmation, but there is presumably a difference between a temporary interruption to supply caused by, let us say, a dispute in the fishing industry in Calais, from the imposition of new customs checks which will apply at all border crossings into the UK, and which will be a permanent problem for particularly the automotive industry to deal with. Is that a fair assumption?
Helen, would you like to just finally comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, Lord Fortnum, that is a fair assumption. We are looking for some kind of simplification at the border. The UK have already only last week talked about some easements at the border control, which we hope will provide some operational easements, but we're yet to see the detail to know for certain if they're going to deliver enough for the industry and enough for anybody that's bringing goods into the country.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Baroness Kramer.
Thank you. Well, I was going to ask about stockpiling, and I still do have a follow-up question. So I believe it was Helen talked about the use of flexibility at the moment, so that if, for example, the Calais route, there's a strike at the Calais route, you then divert products through various other ports. How much more complex is diverting between different ports in a post-Brexit scenario? And I just asked because I remember conversations at which it was almost impossible sometimes to adapt the paperwork to record a different route. So I'd just like to explore that a little bit.
If you forgive me, I'm not a customs or expert, but my understanding is that when we've done that temporarily in the past, the paperwork was pretty much the same. Now, I can confirm this in writing. That's my understanding. So going forward, the issue will be the actual the import declarations at the border and the paperwork you have to show at the border, because there will have to be something, and it's about how we can reduce that friction to be able to prove that as a later date, maybe with having a 30-day clearing window, for example.
Yeah, so it was going forward that I was asking the question. Obviously, historically, that hasn't been an issue. So anything that you could tell us about that, I think would be extremely helpful.
Of course.
Could I just perhaps ask you and Paul, and anyone else could come in, but have you looked at the various likely scenarios and costed, this is in terms of customs checks, and costed what each scenario might particularly add? Is there any way you could give us a range from your sort of best likely case to your worst possible case, to give us a sense of what we're looking at in terms of scale?
We haven't done any work on various different scenarios. We just looked at if you like, some work that had been previously done and looked at what that might be for the UK. And what we got is a 10 to 15% increase in costs for transport and potential for administrative burden. Again, we move from a situation where we have a lot of businesses who are large operations and very experienced exporters, not just to the EU, but to a variety of other nations as well. But we have a high number of relatively small businesses for whom, for the last probably two to 3 decades, they haven't had to deal with the sort of customs regimes, the paperwork, the planning, and some of the logistics that they are likely to have to deal with. So it hasn't been, or isn't been practical for us to be able to put those into place, and because we haven't really had any scenarios to plan against. We haven't had a great deal of clarity certainly from the UK government on all of its plans. There's been lots of talk about the various ways in which we can go about trying to ease some of those burdens, but we haven't had we haven't got as far as to be able to plan with any degree of certainty or even do some scenario planning. So I'm sorry about that.
Thank you. If I may, because I'm mindful of time, go on to Lord Berkeley's question.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask, I think, Neil and Helen in particular, about the extent to which they or their suppliers or transport logistics people make use of the authorised economic operators system that the government has mentioned. Because Paul mentioned the involvement of SMEs, who on the whole I think are not using it. how much is that going to cause delay and cost to these particular operators? Because as you've all said, often the materials and the parts go backwards and forwards several times. And I suppose, just following on from Baroness Kramer's question, how much of all this, in addition to the issues of rules of origin and type approval, might make your businesses move away from the UK to the EU or anywhere else in the future? Maybe Helen could start.
Thank you, Lord Buckley. Yes, so if you're looking at, we are an authorized economic operator. Vauxhall Motors has a AEO status because we currently import parts in from the rest of the world. But I think I have to be very clear. My understanding is that with AEO, it doesn't negate the need for operational easement. So we still have to have an element of import declarations at the border. So there is a if you like, a paperwork exchange at the border, but the AEO means that we have a 30-day window to then declare the goods and to pay the necessary tariffs. So AEO isn't the answer to everything, unless maybe the government said to take advantage of operational easements at the border, you need to be AEO authorized. So that's the only way that we could see that operationally working. When you talk about moving the business away from the EU, we have invested in the past couple of years in our plant in Luton, and it's no secret that we are due to make an investment at our plant in Ellesmere Port, but we need to understand the trading arrangements in which we're making that investment at Ellesmere Port. So until we have the clarity over what Brexit looks like, then we will make a decision.
Thank you.
Just from sorry, just say on an aerospace point of view, what we've discovered, as Helen has said, that some of our larger companies have AEO status, but it's quite an onerous process to go through. And certainly when we've raised the issue with HMRC, they've effectively said if it wasn't useful to you before kind of the Brexit negotiations, it is unlikely to be useful to you after. So we too have been hoping for a much more widespread use of that mechanism to ease some of the burdens and some of the potential checks at the border. But you know, the advice that we had received from HMRC was sort of kind of dissuading people from pursuing that route.
Lord Berkeley, you wanted to come back?
If I could just come back and maybe ask Neil, I mean, all this to me means that there's going to be longer delays at frontiers, because you're not the only sectors who will have the same problems. You've got the whole food and drinks and fresh vegetables and things as well. Can you see problems with delays at frontiers which could compound what Baroness Kramer was talking about as a need to stockpile or move elsewhere?
Yes, I think that if there are delays at the border, it will require us to add inventory to our business, either in the UK to buffer against products coming in, or in other locations where we need to supply customers with products we make in the UK. So for sure there will be. It's difficult for us to estimate what that will be at the moment, as we don't know what the extent of the delays might be. If I could just come back on the AEO question, I think, well, it's certainly my understanding that can reduce the delays, but it protects us from our obligations in terms of customs and the border. So it may be an easement, but it won't be a complete solution, I think is.
Jill, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, yes, I did. AEO, as you say, is incredibly complex, and we as a company have been looking at trying to implement it for the last 3 years without any success. We've made some progress towards meeting the requirements of HMRC, but they are very exacting, and for a company of our size with a very small trade compliance team, it's very difficult. When you balance that against the fact that AEO has very few tangible benefits, we still need to comply with all the paperwork, as Helen said. There are some reductions in bonds and guarantees, but other than that, there's no or very few tangible benefits. Perhaps if it was to be the case that if you're AEO, there were dedicated customs checkpoints and a faster flow of goods, more companies like ourselves would be able to put the investment in to put it in place.
Thank you. Thank you, Lord Lilly. Lord Lilly, can you turn your mute off?
Are there any unilateral measures the UK could take to reduce non-tariff barriers to UK trade, such as recognising EU regulatory standards or streamlining customs checks, and how effective would they be? I think Helen's already answered that, so maybe one of the Paul, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously things that we can do. Obviously, if the UK accepts the European standards on aviation safety, that's a good thing, and that reduces one element of the challenge. But as we export 90+% of what we produce here in the UK. So for us, it's what the rest of what does the rest of Europe and what does the rest of the world do in relation to what we do. So whilst it's good that the UK is easing the burden, the bigger challenge is getting the deal right with the European Union.
You've mentioned today, and you mentioned in evidence to a previous select committee in the Commons, a figure of £1.5 billion in the costs of non-tariff barriers at the border if we have customs checks, or even if we're a free trade area. This is 15% of your exports to Europe. It seems an extraordinarily high figure. How did you acquire it?
So the work that we did was based on a series of studies that were undertaken, I'm going to say, by a variety of other international bodies to look at. I mean, in the work that they were doing, they were looking at actually what do people save, or how do costs get reduced when you introduce various customs easements and, if you like, the normal benefits of free trade agreements, which is to reduce the level of friction at the borders. So the work we did was looking at, okay, if that's the benefit that comes with reducing these things, so we can make some assumptions around how that might impact on how we then have to do business, given that we are effectively putting these same measures back in place.
You're referring, I think, because that's what you said in your evidence, the other select committee, that you got it from an OECD report entitled The Costs and Benefits of Trade Facilitation in 2009. I looked that up. It doesn't have any mention of the aviation industry. What it does say is trade transaction costs may reach as much as 15% of the value of traded goods in some cases. And that 15%, which is far higher than any other of the studies that they did, came from a particular study carried out by the European Community out of the Single Market Programme in 1989 on the costs of trade within Europe, between European countries, and how that we're going to solve that by introducing the single market. So can you confirm you just applied 15% to 10 billion, you got 1.5 billion?
We've always
came from this source.
We've already said it's been a range of figures, and that's one of the sources, and that's up to include that range. Yes, we've not tried to pretend that we have an exact number, but we've always given it as an indication of the likely costs. We would love to see other people's work.
So it came from an irrelevant report 20 or 30 years ago, which didn't mention aviation. You've put this figure £1.5 billion in public. It got into our briefing for this thing, but it has actually no basis in your own experience of companies in your industry. It doesn't come from evaluating their costs.
We've worked very closely with our members on the challenges that they face. That's a piece of the evidence that we had available and shared with people. And we asked people whether that was reflective of their own experience, both of working here in the UK when they export to all parts of the world. So, a third of what we export is to Europe, but 2/3 isn't. So our members have quite a good understanding and experience of the processes that they have to comply with in those circumstances. So we think it's a reasonable basis, and we'd welcome, clarification or indeed evidence from others on what the actual costs will be. But I think if you listen to most of our colleagues, both in the transport industry and other sectors, I don't believe it's that far away.
Well, none of the other 12 studies covered by OECD mentioned a figure remotely like 15%. And the Japanese one, which was the most recent one, put it at 0.8%. I just mentioned that, but I think I've finished my question.
Lily, do you have any follow-up?
No, those are my follow-ups.
Thank you. Lord Shipley?
I'd like to ask a general question of everybody, please, but perhaps best if it was answered first by Paul Everitt. The general question is whether there are any areas where it would help your business if the UK or the EU was more ambitious in their negotiating position, including cooperation with specific EU agencies. But I go to Paul Everitt first, because you said in reply to Baroness Verma's first question that you wanted to be part of the European Aviation Safety Agency. And I think you said that you need a relationship with the EU to be sustained, and you wanted to be part of the future shaping of policy. And I think you said in reply to a question from Lord Russell that the European Aviation Safety Agency has worked extremely well. So I wondered, Paul, if there was anything specific you wanted to add to the importance of working closely with specific EU agencies.
Yes, I mean, so to confirm, our number one priority for the last 4 years has been to ensure or to seek the UK's continued membership of the European Aviation Safety Agency, because we believe it's one of the most important kind of mechanisms to secure future success. Sadly, that is not the government's nor the European Union's ambition. We believe, however, that it could and should be, and indeed it would be possible to meet both sides' concerns and established red lines, because there are at least some existing precedents which suggest that some of the challenges that are being laid out, particularly ECJ jurisdiction, could be addressed.
So can I just pursue that? Is this a matter of current negotiation, to your knowledge, or not?
It is not. But the UK government says that it is not willing to seek membership, and it says that the European Union doesn't want to be.
Sorry, and the damage to the UK then would be what?
Well, for us, so as we've talked about, there are obviously cost implications if we have to do dual certification, but it's more that in the global aerospace industry, there are two, perhaps if you include China, three drivers of future regulation: Europe, the US, and potentially China. Now, within the European Aviation Safety Agency, the UK, and more importantly, UK industry, has a direct voice in shaping how new regulations, and particularly how we adapt regulations to potentially new types of aircraft, new propulsion systems, a whole range of things. We are currently, or were currently, instrumental in shaping those. We won't have that opportunity going forward. Therefore, irrespective of what we do in the UK, we may well do some great work, some great R&D, we may well establish some great products, but we will always be tailing the implementation of those regulations in those other more internationalized regulatory bodies.
Thank you. So could I ask then Helen, Jill and Neil just to respond to the general area and to say whether you have similar problems? Are there specific EU agencies that you are concerned about continued membership of? If we go to Helen first.
Specifically for automotive, not so much, no. The way for our industry, some of the areas that I think are relevant to your questions are areas around reach and those kinds of agreements. As I've already said, what's important for us also is for when we have UK type approval, is to recognise the testing that we've already undertaken in the EU as permissible evidence.
Okay, and to Jill?
No, nothing from me.
Or Neil?
No, I've nothing more to add to that.
Thank you.
Summed it up.
Thank you very much. Lord Lamont.
How prepared are your businesses for the new trading arrangements at the end of the transition period on the 31st of December? And along with that, and I know the answer to this question, what do you need from government to support you in this process? And I know from what you've said, the answer is you need to know what the situation is and what you're required to conform with.
Who would you like to start the questions off with, Lord Lamont?
Well, I don't mind, whoever.
So, Helen?
Yep, no, I'm happy to start. I personally, with our organisation, we have looked at benefits and done risk assessments of Brexit since the actual referendum, the announcement that the referendum was held. So for a number of years, we've looked at the implications across the business. And we now are planning for two scenarios, and that is one where there is a free trade agreement or one where there is a hard Brexit. And we have a European team that's dedicated to undertaking that work because it fundamentally changes the way that we can do business between the UK and the EU, and as we've already explained, there's lots of cost associated with it for our organisation. So I would say that if there is a free trade agreement, then what's quite important for our industry is where some of those agreements are actually phased in over time. This is something that's not unusual in free trade agreements that the EU have negotiated before. And so if I take the idea of phase-in, for example, and we look at rules of origin that we've already discussed today, what we would like to see for the first year is a loosening of those restrictions as and when we, to enable us as a business to get the necessary supplier and long-term supplier declarations from our supply chain to prove rules of origin. So, for example, if we start at a level that is higher than where we would like to end up, so maybe 60-65% non-originating material, and then to reduce that level over a number of years to the agreed level, that would be really helpful for us as a business and as an industry in adapting to the new ways and the new rules.
Thank you, Paul.
Again, obviously, we've been looking at this issue for some time. A lot of businesses did an awful lot of planning and indeed contingency building in the run-up to a previous potential no-deal scenario, and those focused predominantly on two areas. One was building inventory to ensure that if there was delays, disruptions, business could continue, and the other was to actually move some of its registrations into Europe so that it would continue to be effectively a sort of third country approval under the European Aviation Safety Agency's regime, which is to try to mitigate some of the impacts of leaving without a proper arrangement. I think it would, so that we are, we're still waiting the detail in a number of areas, and clearly, as Lord Lamont has said, that's a kind of well-known fact. I think that the challenge for us is that some of the mitigations that we had put in place, particularly inventory building, obviously over the course of the last 3 to 4 months and the impact of the COVID crisis, that has certainly kind of run down some of those buffers, and indeed the general impact on aerospace and aviation has weakened significantly the supply chain here in the UK.
Thank you, Jill.
I would say for a business of our size, we've not been able to have a dedicated team to scenario plan for the implications of Brexit. We have done things like stockpiling inventory, and we've looked at a couple of things, but the reality is that we cannot say whether we're prepared or not because we do not know what we're preparing for. And what we'd ideally want is a 12 months notice period following the publication of the finalised non-tariff measures so that we can prepare properly. Thank you. And Neil?
Yes, I'd echo what Jill says. It's difficult for us to prepare when we don't know what we're preparing for. We've taken measures within our business as we had to last year with the possibility of a hard Brexit, so we can dust those things off. But we really need the clarity to understand what we're going to, and then we can start to make the preparations. And certainly a transition period of 12 months would be extremely useful to help us do that. Also, I think because it's not just us, it's the complete supply chain. We may be ready, but if our suppliers are not ready, things will not work in the way they should do. So, we need also the time to make sure that the complete supply chain is able to work with whatever the new framework may be.
Thank you. Baroness Kramer, you wanted to come in. Would you unmute?
Sorry, that was unmuting was tricky there. That's just a question. I mean, we're now well into the negotiations, so I don't know for the individuals who are here today, if there is a choice between no deal, but therefore certainty in the next few weeks, versus continued uncertainty, potentially leading to a free trade agreement, which is more important for your business to be able to cope? Getting certainty, even if it means no deal, or living with uncertainty if there is still a deal in the offing.
Who would you like to direct that to, Baroness Grimble?
Well, whoever would like to answer it. I imagine Paul and Helen probably, but I would have thought the others might have a quick comment.
I think from an aerospace industry, I think our focus is still, we would like a deal. I think that's in our long-term best interests and would create the best future for us as a country. So, I think we've all unfortunately become somewhat used to having to deal with more uncertainty than we would ideally like. But we would prefer to live with that uncertainty a bit longer if it meant that we ended up with a comprehensive and successful trade agreement.
Helen?
I would agree with Paul. The priority for us is to have a comprehensive trade agreement. But if I'm honest with you, the planning that we do on top of all of our day jobs as a business for a hard Brexit and an FTA Brexit, actually some of those actions are the same, because actually from automotive industry point of view, if you're looking at the free trade agreement that the UK government wants, actually it's a very firm form of Brexit. So actually some of the planning isn't too dissimilar between the two.
And Neil, Jill, do you have any comments?
I'll begin. No, I don't really have anything to add to that. I think we would prefer a comprehensive, ambitious agreement to a hard Brexit.
Jill?
Yes, we would prefer a comprehensive agreement.
And I know Lord Turnbull and Lord Lamont want to have some very short interventions. So if I turn to Lord Lamont first.
Yes, if I could, in the interest of brevity, perhaps put the question to Helen and Mr. Everitt. Although all the witnesses have stressed the importance of alignment and, in case Mr. Everitt expressed scepticism about any need for divergence, I'm sure the government understand that, and the idea that the government would impose divergence on industries that don't want it is not realistic, not what's going to happen. But it's surely possible to imagine a degree of agreement on alignment on a voluntary basis or a political basis or a temporary basis, accompanied by conformity assessments or equivalence arrangements, and over time give the government the chance, if it wishes eventually down the line, to alter the arrangements. Surely that is perfectly possible. And I understand you're looking after your own interests, as you must, but an agreement on this is not impossible.
No, and if I may, you're quite right, Lord Mont. It is very much the UK government's priority, and as I said, we have been working with them on that position. I think the issue that we see is that's not a priority for the European Commission, and regulatory alignment on those other areas such as level playing field provisions, so state aid, taxation, and environmental, is currently agreement on those areas is holding everything else up, and until there is some movement on the regulatory agreement on those level playing field provisions, that's preventing us from having those more sector specific discussions.
Thank you.
So that's exactly the same situation. We can propose lots of different things. Ultimately, this is a negotiation between the UK and the European Commission, and at the moment the European Commission is unhappy with other aspects of the negotiation and therefore is not spending the time or allowing progress in the more detailed areas that our members are, I guess, most interested in.
Yeah, well, that is their negotiating position now.
Lord Turnbull.
Can I raise the question of dispute resolution? Supposing a UK-based business earns a major contract, how do you deal with a case where a disgruntled loser in that tender process goes to the Commission and says, they say this met regulatory requirements. They say this met rules of origin. We don't think that they did. And who will judge the truth of that in a world in which the Commission, of course, is working for them? It's no longer working for us. So on many of these areas, on equivalence and so on, the Commission has reserved for itself the right to be the arbitrator. And is that a satisfactory position?
Paul, briefly, would you come back on that?
So, I mean, the only thing I can really comment is on broader matters. I'm not sure, but in the area that we are most concerned about, which is around aviation safety. I mean, there are rarely, if any, colleagues assure me there have been almost none during the existence of the European Aviation Safety Agency. It is a well-respected body. We have participated in shaping the rules. They have worked exceedingly well.
Thank you. And given time, I'm having to draw this evidence session to a close, and I'd like to first thank our witnesses very much for coming in. This isn't the easiest way to conduct an evidence session, so thank you very much for your perseverance, and it has been a very interesting session for us all. You will get the transcripts, and please, if there are any corrections, if you could put them in as swiftly as possible. And I think the committee appreciates very much you coming in on this meeting this morning and giving us a real wide perspective of the challenges, but also of the opportunities that you see that face us. So thank you very much indeed. And if I may just ask colleagues to just stay online for one moment longer whilst we exit our witnesses, so that we can have the instructions for the next part of this meeting.
Okay, thank you.